This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger is joined by Dr. Henry Now, who serves as Distinguished Scholar at the Ronald Reagan Institute. They discuss the legacy of President Ronald Reagan, exploring his economic policies, leadership style, and the significance of his ideas in shaping contemporary politics. Dr. Now emphasizes the importance of understanding Reagan's record and the impact of his beliefs on his presidency, particularly in the context of the Cold War and his approach to negotiation.
Dr. Henry Now, welcome to the show.
Good to be here. Thank you, Roger.
Well, our viewers and listeners heard your background. You are a scholar and not only someone who has written on issues tied to President Reagan and conservative thinking, but you also were someone who served in the Reagan administration on the National Security Council, had a really important role in that very interesting seam between the national economy and national security. Just for those watching and listening, tell us what you did during those Reagan White House years.
Right. Well, thank you. I went into the academy, the academic community, and worked there for 45 years. And by happenstance, in large measure, I ran into Richard Allen during, I think, the summer of 1978. And one thing led to another, and I was brought into the Reagan administration on the National Security Council, dealing with international, domestic, but primarily international economic activities, and worried about the stagflation that existed in the world economy, worried about the differences with the allies over how to approach that stagflation, and witnessed, I think, in those early years, frankly, the leadership of Ronald Reagan, which was extraordinary. So one of my interests since then has been in trying to focus people's attention on the record, on Reagan's record, and to tell the story of how this man, in an unusual way, in a unique way, how he went about dealing with one of the toughest jobs in the world, and did so very successfully, not only reviving the American economy, but launching the information age and the globalization of the world economy, and finally, ultimately, winning the Cold War and a major victory for freedom and capitalism.
Well, not only because of your... Go ahead.
I just want to... That debate about what Reagan did or didn't do is very important at two levels. At the level of contemporary politics, and the Reagan Institute's involved very much in trying to make people aware of how Reagan might have dealt with some of these problems today. But it's also very, very important at another level. That is at the level of the academy, at the level of scholarship. And so one of the things I know you've been trying to do, and I've helped somewhat, is to make sure that the Reagan Institute doesn't forget that scholarship element, where we influence what's being written about Reagan, influence who's reading what about Reagan, et cetera. And in that context, my association with the Reagan Institute's been very, very gratifying to me after, a life in the academy, interested now in making sure that Ronald Reagan is taken into account in that academy.
Well, and you've certainly persuaded me early on in my tenure at the Reagan Institute. You emphasized the importance of making sure that we are engaging young scholars in particular who are writing about President Reagan or the period where President Reagan served. We're engaging with them, helping them, supporting them. Our colleague, Dr. Anthony Eames, is the product of that conversation. Our scholarly initiatives we invest in. And of course, you are a big part of that, as you just referenced, in your role as distinguished scholar here at the Ronald Reagan Institute. And I see you're wearing the merch also. So there you're doing your part there. And over your left shoulder for our viewers, of course, there's a picture of President Reagan shaking your hand with a Henry. Now, it looks no different than you look today, Henry. At least the way it comes through here in our Riverside session. But things kind of outlining all that, because it's both about today, but also what happened, the historical record. And you often, when we have our conversations, which I always enjoy and learn from, emphasize that we have to really go and see what Reagan said. understand what he did, right? Almost, you just got to give Reagan the fair shake to understand what had happened and not to allow, biases or narratives that emerged then that are continued now to dominate the thinking. Just see what the record has. And you've done that in your own scholarship. I know you continue to do that. But of course, it's the basis now for our conversation on this Reaganism podcast, because you published a book review recently in National Review, which is entitled, "Did Reagan's Ideas Matter?" And of course, without reading your review, I knew the answer was yes, with many exclamation points. But you actually, that's the headline for your book review of Max Boot's recent book, Reagan, His Life and Legend. And so, Henry, you, certainly with our work together, you read and comment and engage in much of the scholarship on Reagan and his era. But what brought you to actually take to the pages of National Review to review Max Boot's most recent biography?
Well, look, I don't want to take anything away from Boot and his effort. He spent a lot of time, 10 years altogether, he estimates, producing the book. It's a very difficult thing to do, to write a book of that magnitude. But I read the book and came away with the feeling that he had really told only one side of the story. And he wanted to tell that story because he wanted to kind of diminish the significance of Reagan in the contemporary political debate, maybe even identify Reagan with Trumpism. And I thought that was just extremely unfair. That was interpreting Reagan too much in the context of contemporary politics, that it didn't follow the record now, which is available. He addresses some of that record, but he also excludes some very important pieces of that record. And so I was reacting in this sort of slogan manner that I like. I was asking him, let the Reagan record be Reagan. You know, when we were in the White House, we used to say, let Reagan be Reagan. But now it's the Reagan record. And he, I think, does not do that record due diligence, due significance. And so I wanted to make that clear. He obviously is ignoring a lot of the literature that suggests that the Soviet Union was in really a tough spot and was put into that tough spot through a pressure campaign by the Reagan administration. Part of Reagan's approach of peace through strength, he was determined to build up his leverage vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Many things happened in the course of the 1980s that weakened the Soviet Union, not just sanctions, but also driving oil prices down, which was done through a cooperative relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, all of which have added to the pressures that the Soviet Union was feeling normally because of its very inefficient system. And the fact that it was going to crumble eventually. That's what Ronald Reagan believed. That's what many of us in the White House believed. We didn't know when.
Right.
That system was so inadequate, was so inefficient, it was going to fall. But it fell when it did, in large measure, because Reagan organized a significant and very steady approach, which was outlined in a couple of national security directives early in his administration, and which for the first time suggested that we were going to try to alter or at least have an impact on the internal politics in the Soviet Union. That is, we understood that we will not get a resolution of this confrontation with the Soviet Union until, in fact, the Soviet Union democratizes or begins to liberalize. And Gorbachev began to do that under the circumstances that had been created by this pressure campaign. Now, Boot doesn't want to acknowledge that for some reason. He wants to claim that, Gorbachev, the whole thing.
Well, he gives a lot of credit to Gorbachev. And actually, I encourage everybody to check out National Review and read Henry's review of the Boot book. Again, Did Reagan's Ideas Matter? But you seem to really get provoked. It seems to really provoke Henry now. And when this, for viewers and listeners, you're listening to Henry, seeing Henry, and he seems like, this very kind of laid back, at ease scholar, but you can get pretty fired up over these issues. I've seen it. And the word that seems to get you fired up reading this piece was Boot's assessment of Reagan, and the part that perhaps he didn't appreciate, that is Max Boot, prior to spending the decade as you referenced, was Reagan's pragmatism. And that really seems to irritate you. Outline what Boot is arguing with kind of this Reagan pragmatism. What do you think it really means and why that bothered you so much? Of course, it connects to what you were just outlining, Henry, which is there was this plan. He had an idea of what he wanted to do, and he pursued it. Yeah. And it was very much somebody who was going after his plan, his set of ideas.
That's right. I mean, look, he shaped events. Ronald Reagan helped to shape events. He did not just react to events. Now, as much as we applaud pragmatism, and believe me, in a democracy, it's very important, a pragmatist is always dealing with the current situation. They're always responding to what is happening at the time. And they're taking for granted the reality that they face. They don't ask any questions who's created that reality. And therefore, you can't really, to call Reagan a pragmatist, when he came into office with a clear set of ideas, people then, by the way, called him an ideologue. They said he was, misled by ideology. So interpretations of Reagan go in both directions. Some who say he was an ideologue, and now Boot, who says he was a pure pragmatist. Look, it's important to understand that Reagan wasn't just in the office for the game of reacting in politics and, making deals. He wasn't in the office for that purpose. He came into office with a set of ideas that he'd been developing for 30, 40 years. We now can put that record together, trying to do that in a small book that I'm working on. But he knew where he was going, and he examined his ideas all along the way. Then when he came into office, he put them into place. Now, yes, he didn't get 100% of everything he was looking for. So in some of the deals he made, yeah, he got 80%. And he was interested in getting some agreement, but on his terms. I mean, my goodness, who wouldn't take an 80%, return on compromise? So that's what I think really, upset me. I mean, a pragmatist is not going to go anywhere except where the events of the day move them, except where current circumstances drive them. And that's not really, Reagan turned the world around. I mean, you can go back and look at the record. He turned the 1970s around economically, politically, psychologically, in terms of America's confidence in itself, et cetera. And that story has to be told. You can't prove it one way or the other, but you must, I think, consider it.
It strikes me that the issue here, and one that you took the pen to the pages of National Review, was Boot's suggestion that, he has this line, the great communicator was also the great compromiser. His entire life was characterized by a series of deals. And in some ways, the INF Treaty, that was a very important deal. Mm-hmm. I think what you seem to be reacting to is that, and what Boot's suggesting, is that he really didn't have a compass, that he was somebody who was willing to give up on those ideas, right? Who, at the end of the day, made whatever shifts were necessary, as some politicians do. They follow which way the wind was blowing. And there is some of this that's, that he's rehashing the arguments that, well, Reagan, from the first term to the second term, he was a cold warrior in the first term. And then in the second term, he gave up on the brinksmanship and compromise in the way that Boot is describing. And I think the issue is not that compromise is anything bad in its own right. But it's whether or not he was compromising because he was getting 80% of the ideas he believed in deeply.
Right.
But take me through Henry Now's understanding of that second term, right? Why we should interpret the second term as not the abandonment, not that Boot uses that language as stridently as I am right now, but why is it not the abandonment of the Reagan-esque principles that defined the first term, what launched him into office when Henry Now was on the National Security Council staff?
Look, if there were a time when he might have changed course, it would have to be 1982, not 1983. All right, because by 1983, things were beginning to fall into place. Economic recovery, the INF deployment was going forward, completed in November of 1983. 1982 was really the pits. It was the bottom of sort of, he by the way, his popularity declined to 35%. And I recall a meeting in November of 1982 in the Oval Office with the president, where we actually, the National Security Council, brought up all of the obstacles that seemed to be in the way of him achieving his ideas through his initial policies. And there I saw Reagan dig in. There I saw him with the environment. Nothing was working at that time. His economic program was not was not going anywhere. The mass protests in Europe were trying to derail the IMF deployment. By the way, the Republicans lost 26 seats in Congress, which they never controlled, by the way, in the House in the fall of 1982. So, I mean, Reagan this was the time. If he had had any doubts about his ideas and why he had come to office, that would have been the moment. And in fact, he even said in that meeting, he said, look, I didn't come here. Somebody, mentioned that, look, should we look at plan B and see what we can come up with? And his point was, no, look, I've come into office to put these ideas in place. I think they're going to work. I think the Soviets are going to come back to the arms table. By the way, they had also walked away from the arms table. And so Reagan was looking very clearly at the reality. He saw that it wasn't very good, but he was putting his faith in his ideas. And one of the puzzle to me and to many others is, where did he get that concept in his ideas?
Tell us about that. It's so interesting to me.
In the evolution of his thinking.
Yes, I mean, and this, so ideas, of course, you argue is what animated President Reagan. I'm persuaded by that. It's clear that if he wasn't animated by ideas and he was animated by other things like remaining in office or seeking, popularity or ensuring that his standing in the polls were at a certain number, he would have moved off those positions, as you just outlined, early in his first term, not after he was reelected, with unprecedented margins, right? 49 out of 50 states, the largest margin in terms of electoral college votes and the like. But it is interesting to me, and perhaps you can share a little bit about what you're working on now, Henry, which is, where do the ideas come from? I mean, it is remarkable. President Reagan believed deeply that the communist system was not sustainable, that its economy couldn't compete against the United States in an arms race, couldn't compete against the U.S. economy when we unleashed, the free market principles that Reagan believed governed and should govern the U.S. economy. That wasn't as a result of some advisor speaking into his ear, because as I think you've working on, and you could probably, kind of outline a little bit, these were things that he was thinking about decades before he entered the Oval Office.
Yeah, and it's interesting. He too puzzled at one point about why people didn't know where he stood. He says, my gosh, I've been talking about these things and writing about them and making speeches about them and doing radio addresses about them for decades. Why can't they just listen? And it's a real puzzle. One of the questions in my mind is, and I think it should be in the mind of any scholar of the Reagan period, and that is to ask, where were these speeches and these letters, et cetera? Did Reagan ever alert his speech writing staff to the existence of those? I think he did at one point, although I can't yet totally nail it down. But why was there this complete kind of almost disregard for the, for the record, in his own hand? He wrote over 1 million words. The letters alone are absolutely fascinating, because they reveal him in a way that he doesn't even reveal in his most intimate moments with his staff. They go way back. And they go way back. In other words, he's already thinking in the late 1940s and early 1950s about negotiations, because he's president of the Screen Actors Guild and he's involved in some very tough negotiations. So he writes a piece about what would you look for in a negotiation. It's a fabulous piece. I hope maybe it'll be the first time that it gets out in my book, but it shouldn't have. It should have come out many years earlier. And he just says that, look, you've got several things you got to consider. You don't want to just do negotiations through strength, he said, because then you would just strike. Now he's talking about a union. You would just strike, and then you would say to the other guy, look, I'm just going to sit here and strike until you recognize that I have more strength than you do, and you collapse or you cave. He says, it's not quite going to do it that way. You got to have something that's reasonably attractive to the other side. All right, so that they buy in, because you want a lasting solution to the problem. You don't want it to turn around the next day and exist in a different form. So, he quips later in office when Schultz and he are talking about negotiations. Oh, he said, you know what? He said, so far negotiating with Gorbachev is just like negotiating with the labor unions. He said, Gorbachev is a snap after my experience with the labor union. So, I mean, one needs to go back and look at, and a lot of that stuff is also still in the archives, maybe not even processed. Because, it reveals the way he thought in general about negotiations. And the remarkable thing is that he applied these ideas. I mean, he writes a memo in 1963. You know about that, but somebody interested in this subject should be sure they consider that memo about how he would deal with the Soviet Union. And by golly, in 1982, 1983, he deals with the Soviet Union exactly in those terms. It's remarkable. I mean, how many presidents do you suppose have ever done that? Have ever outlined a strategy 20 years ahead of time, come into office now? Remember, those ideas have just been solidified during that period. I mean, he's developing them all the time, but they're becoming firmer and firmer and firmer. And he uses them. He actually he puts them into his national security directives, 75 and 32 in 1982, 1983. A big service, by the way, which the national security advisor at that time, Bill Clark, did, not only for Ronald Reagan, but for the country. And so if a man does that, if a president does that kind of thing, you mean you're going to argue to me that ideas don't matter? that those are just ideas. They don't.
Or
really,
the argument really, that the ideas didn't matter to Reagan. I mean, that's what I think is most injurious, and I think you're responding to here, right? That ideas weren't animating him in his presidency as opposed to pragmatism or something else.
Right, correct. I mean, we do look. He was pragmatic. I don't want to say he wasn't, but if we make that his strategy, if we make that his whole philosophy, we are missing the real Ronald Reagan. And
the real Ronald Reagan. I mean, you outline a few in the end. I mean, he was somebody, a person of faith, right? A person who also believed that the struggle in the Cold War was this battle of ideas.
Yes.
Right. And I think our friend Willem Bowden, in his book, Peacekeeper, really advances that throughout his treatment of the entire Reagan presidency. That Reagan saw the Cold War as a battle of ideas. Why was that so important, Henry? What were some of those ideas?
There are three sort of major arguments about the Cold War and how it ended, et cetera. I mean, one is very popular among the realists, and that is that it was a balance of power thing. We simply competed and defeated them, all right, in some sort of a power contest, economic as well as military. Then you have the school that says that, no, we did it all by diplomacy. We got rid of the using military defense, expenditures as a mark of our strength, et cetera. This is the argument that's made by those who say Reagan flipped from his first to his second term and realized that, he could do things by diplomacy because now he had a person in Gorbachev that he could deal with. And then there's a third group way of thinking about that, and that is that ideas. It was a confrontation. It's the way that Reagan viewed the Cold War, that it was a competition of ideas. These ideas were buried deep, by the way, in his philosophy of life, because they had to do with freedom, and most importantly, freedom of religion. And what he really hated about the communist system was the fact that they did not give their people a choice of religions. They didn't allow them to practice their religion. And so here on the one hand, you had a part of the world that was focused on freedom of the individual, especially freedom of religion, a country that had that tradition of being interested in freedom of religion. And then on the other side, someone who denied their people that freedom. So there was no doubt. And by the way, it appears early on. He writes essays as a young teenager in Dixon, Illinois. And it's all about the world in terms of a contest of spirits, a contest of ideas. So there's another case where over 50 years, he keeps his fundamental framework constant. And then, of course, realizes that if you're going to have a set of ideas and you're going to try to implement them, you've got to have, in a democracy, in a republic, you've got to have a proving majority behind you. You've got to have a majority coalition behind you. So this informed his campaigns. It informed how he gathered all of the groups that eventually supported him, 49 states, as you point out, in 1984, and how he then used those coalitions to actually embed legislation in the Congress, because he had to have the coalition to win, and he had to have the coalition to put the ideas into legislative directives.
It's kind of interesting that, you know, what's animating you is the dismissal of all the ideas and the emphasis by Boot on the part of, you know, compromise, which, you know, as we've been discussing, is overstated and misses so much of what Reagan focused on prior to becoming president and set really the foundation of what he wanted to do as president. At the same time, this idea of making your policies and ideas durable requires some level of compromise as well, and that does seem to be a bit of a lost art in our national politics today. So, you know, as you know, as a scholar, Henry, and someone who is following the world that it is today, I mean, what is that? What is the legacy of compromise that perhaps, I don't know if you agree with me, but I think, you know, in some respects we're missing today in our national politics?
Well, you know, sometimes I wonder if, you know, your willingness to compromise or your tendency to compromise has something to do, is related in some way with how strongly you believe in what you're doing. Reagan obviously felt very strongly. Good Lord, you can't read the 40 years of writings that he did without understanding how much he believed in his ideas. Now, that's going to make you somewhat reluctant to compromise as against a person who, you know, has differing ideas or maybe conflicting ideas and isn't particularly persuaded by one set of ideas versus another set of ideas. That person may be just in the game to compromise and to play the game. All right. That's the pure pragmatist. Reagan had strong views, and I think that's the two parties, by the way, not just the conservative party, not just the Republicans, but also the Democrats. The parties need to remember that. The stronger you persuade the American people that you believe in something, the better you're going to be, or the more ready you're going to be to compromise, all right? Because you know you want those ideas eventually to be embedded in some way. It's a counter conventional sort of way of looking at the contemporary scene. But I firmly believe that one of the reasons we think we have more partisanship and more, you know, stalemate in our system is because we now have two very vibrant political parties. We forget that for 60 years, from 1932 to 1995, we only had really one party. And you can look at the control of Congress during that period in the White House, and it's very evident. And by the way, Reagan was very much aware of that. He says, my goodness, the liberals have been in charge of everything forever. We need to be strong and clear in what we are opposing to them, because we are not just opposing them, we are offering a different way from what they're offering. So the stronger we believe, and I say this to the Republican Party and to the Democratic Party, but since I'm Republican, I direct it especially to them, be clear about what you believe. There's no contradiction between being clear about what you believe and willingness to compromise. In fact, you know, if you're going to make compromises that last. And so I would love to see, you know, that sort of view incorporated in the contemporary debate.
Well, it does. The compromise does open up the opportunity for durability. I think what one of the things that perhaps is lost in the state of affairs in Washington is because it seems to be so zero sum. Right, we're a town of executive orders now, as opposed to towns of legislation, and you know, there are many differences between executive orders and laws. But one that I think is most relevant to our conversation right now is that laws tend to have durability; they last, right, as opposed to executive orders just kind of only last as long as the administration in power, which makes them a weakened form of policy. And there's a, not to say that executive orders aren't relevant and important for an executive to govern. There's definitely an important place for it, but we shouldn't confuse it with passage of laws and also acknowledge that it's limited in what it can accomplish in terms of durability.
Process of, you know, getting legislation in a Republican system, that's with a little r, by the way, in a Republican system that is deliberately designed to make it hard to pull together a majority and a coalition. And thankfully so. I mean, I'm very Jeffersonian in that respect. I want checks and balances on, the ability of people to quickly make laws. But that makes the legal process, the legislative process, very difficult. Mm-hmm. And that's why you have to approach it, it seems to me, with very clear ideas. You have to approach it. Reagan was a master at speeches, too. And really, presidents ought to make greater use of that tool to kind of repeatedly inform not only their own staff and their own government, but the country as a whole as to what they're trying to accomplish. And giving them some hints about when they may be ready for compromise. Because Reagan had to, by the way, say no to compromise at critical points in his regime. If he had, I always wonder what would have happened if he had accepted the walk in the woods arms control proposal that everybody wanted him to accept in the summer of 1982. How would that have changed things? How would it have changed things if?
And of course, what you're talking about right now, the walk in the woods was
the walk in the woods was
an attempt here
to deal with the INF problem, and it would have left in place a large number of INF weapons.
Right. So the Soviets during this period of time
might have included the Pershing II missiles.
Right. They had their missiles deployed, and Reagan's approach was basically, we won't put in our intermediate nuclear weapons until the Soviets take all of theirs out, and he was unwilling to even take, let's say in that case, 50% of what he was seeking. I mean, it was truly something he held out on.
By the way, when he put the so-called 0-0 option out in public, a press conference, I think in December, he said at that point, "Look, I want 0. But, I'll take cream cheese," or he had some comment in there about cheese. "I'll take green cheese, somewhere between 0 and a number, if we can move forward together on that." So here was a guy, by the way, it was argued in the newspapers at the time by the Washington political scene. He was argued to be proposing something that was impossible. So you couldn't take him seriously. Well, of course, 5 years later, he got exactly what he proposed. But he did that in part by compromising, but also at key moments, knowing when not to compromise, knowing when to let the circumstances move in your direction so that you are weakening, the circumstances are weakening the Soviet Union. And he saw that happening in 83 and 84. And that's what made him stay on course and then engage Gorbachev so successfully in the second term.
Well, in that respect, we not use the language of compromise. Here right now, we're using the language of deal making, right? Yeah. Right. And so President Trump is looking to cut deals, right? Which at least can be argued, certainly, is a form of compromise.
Yeah, no, it is. Of course it is. But toward what end? It was always clear about Reagan. He laid out so many times his fundamental political philosophy. That is, that it was premised on individual choice, freedom of individuals to choose as much as they can of their, to solve their own problems, to live their own lives. That was so fundamental. And in our system, there's this continuing, debate between those who want to do things at the local level and who depend upon individuals to do the right thing, and those who want to intervene from at the national level, or sometimes even at the global level. And that's a good, healthy debate to have. It's a bad debate to have if one side's not involved,
right?
And the whole situation shifts towards one end or the other. But as long as people are willing, and look, the system's worked for 250 years. It's working today, even with all of its problems. I mean, as long as it keeps these two positions in balance, both of them, by the way, accept the Constitution. Both of them accept the division of powers, etc. And want to make it difficult to make decisions. But I think maybe we're, my hope is that we're going to get used to, over the next decade, a more balanced partisanship in America. And we'll have sort of put behind us this era where one party dominates. By the way, before the Great Depression, the Republicans dominated.
Right.
Everything. And after the Great Depression, the Democrats. I don't know that that's the best way, even though that's maybe one way you get things done, but you may get the wrong things done. That's what a divided
Although
system.
We're seeing that swing back and forth from, correction, overcorrection, at each side, even in this era of divided, deeply divided partisanship, where power is shifting back and forth. Let me pull out from the Reagan period and ask you to look out at the world that we're confronting today, and get your take on how you look at the People's Republic of China, the PRC. Lots of discussion of a second Cold War. We've done podcasts on that topic here with relevant experts on understanding China, the PRC, U.S. national security, and the like. But Henry, coming at the issue of the United States and the PRC and what is generally referred to as a competition between the two, how do you look at it as a competition of ideas, just competition of interests, economic interests, political interests? To what extent are you drawing from your expertise and knowledge, having worked in and studied deeply the Cold War and its relevance to how we think about the PRC today?
Well, I think two things that are somewhat in conflict with one another. On the one hand, it seems to me we are facing a new Cold War with China. It's not as intense as was the confrontation with the Soviet Union, because China doesn't yet have that kind of military capability, and doesn't sit in a very critical geographic position the way the Soviet Union did, basically controlling whoever controlled the central part of Europe controlled the rest of Europe. But it is an ideological confrontation with the Chinese, because they are trying to say to us basically that, look, we're different than the Soviet Union. We're a greater challenge to you because we have an industrialized economy now, because we are united and we have a system that is premised on very different political principles from you, and we're going to show you that those principles can win a confrontation over time. So, and they have a better chance, by the way, than the Soviet Union probably ever did, because they've got this vibrant economy, although the domestic economy is going down. And the more they withdraw from the global economy, I'm not that confident about their growth and their strength.
But nonetheless, there's been remarkable growth. They've adopted features of a free market system,
right,
and it's far more robust.
I don't want us to emphasize the relationship with China. It's a very, we've got to deal with it and look at it as a long run confrontation. But the axis of ideology, the axis of world politics is still in Europe. It's still in Europe. I mean, that's where we could have major conflagrations that immediately involve all kinds of countries, including the Middle East countries. I can conceive of some conflicts in Asia that don't involve, if under certain circumstances, Taiwan might be a limited conflict. It doesn't immediately sort of draw in all of the countries that have been big problems in the evolution of geopolitics in Europe for God knows how many centuries. So I don't want us to lose the focus on Europe. And by the way, there a contemporary World War II scenario is being played out with
Ukraine,
absolutely massacred people and cities and so on. So that's one point. The second point, we need to deal with China. It is a serious confrontation. We should look at it as a long-term kind of Cold War arrangement, creating defense in the region, and then not doing anything to help China overcome the inefficiencies of its own economic and political system. Same attitude we took towards the Soviet Union. Now, that may take a decade or two, so don't expect quick, answers to this. But while we're doing that, remember that Europe is still, and by the way, the Middle East ties into that, it's still where we could have, big problems. And if we were to lose the contest in Europe, we will have lost all the gains in freedom of the last 100 years in Europe. That's not the case in Asia. All right, we didn't have those kind of gains 100 years ago, or the potential for achieving the improvements that we have made in our relationship.
Yeah, well, no doubt.
That's my, I'm just saying let's view them as equal threats. One in the Asian region and the other in the European region. And by the way, build our alliances now cross-regional, as we're starting to do a bit in Asia, where we can at least invite the allies to cooperate in naval and air arrangements.
there are some who view the Indo-Pacific as the region where the most is at stakes for U.S. certainly economic prosperity. The amount of commerce that goes through the Indo-Pacific is greater than what we have through
US
Europe.
now.
And you also look at where you've been in terms of our most important allies and partners. You have Japan certainly is a critical ally. Australia, of course, critical, important ally. You have emerging friendships that are going to be quite consequential in the future. Thinking about India, demographics resides there in terms of the largest populated countries in the world. And there is a number of arguments that one can entertain suggest that the future resides in the Indo-Pacific and the past resides
It's a big
with
argument.
Europe.
I'm urging. I think Reagan would have been a little bit more. I don't want to say guarded, but I don't think he would have. He'd go overboard in declaring kind of a crisis everywhere. I think we have to be careful about that. And I worry a little bit about. I'm not disagreeing that we have to focus on China. It's an important challenge, but I also don't think we should believe that China is 20 feet tall and circumstances favor them. I'm waiting for a really good study to come out to show exactly what some of the long-term prospects are for China, especially as they decouple from the global economy. I mean, I'm one who believes so strongly in free markets, and Reagan would have been one who believed so strongly in free markets. He would say, "Look, let's play it out. Let them try. Let them try to." Surpass us in this or that. By the way, we're not lowering our guard in any way.
And I think the point you made earlier, and we should be mindful of not helping them along the way. And I think that's something that we've only started to realize. And President Trump, during his first administration, was critical in making sure all policy centers in government and national security recognize that, hey, we have to organize ourselves in such a fashion where we're not helping them. And of course, prior to him being elected, we were guilty of that. We're coming to the end of our time here with Dr. Henry Now, who's a distinguished scholar at the Reagan Institute and professor emeritus of political science and international affairs at George Washington University, and author of many books. One that we value here and reference all the time is Conservative Internationalism, Armed Diplomacy under Jefferson, Polk, Truman, and Reagan. Having a great conversation about his review of Max Boot's recent biography of President Reagan. Can read it in National Review, called "Did Reagan's Ideas Matter?" We'll go one last question, Henry, which is a line from your review, which says, "What no biographer should claim, as Boot does, is that his or her accounts are strictly factual," end quote. What are you getting at there as a scholar and someone who's written many volumes and read many more?
It's a point that I think we just have to remind ourselves always, especially in the scholarly world, and we don't. But it's an extremely essential kind of realization that, number one, you can't consider all the facts. I mean, good Lord, none of us. Maybe we'll have a supercomputer, a super duper computer someday who can consider all the facts. I doubt it. We'll be creating new facts every minute. So, we're never going to have all the facts. So you're going to select certain facts, whether you're a policymaker or whether you're a scholar. And you have reasons for doing that. You should be clear about those reasons. You should let your reader know what those reasons are. And then you are going to emphasize certain facts. After you select them, you're going to interpret them. And I think it would be useful for us to realize that the facts will probably always accommodate more than one point of view. And thank goodness, because that's freedom. When you have more than one alternative. If you don't have any alternatives, there's no freedom of choice. So these are sort of very fundamental kind of concessions that we have to make to our limited, cognitive capabilities. And I wish we could do that. We would welcome then additional facts. We wouldn't be talking about facts and these are make-believe. We would be putting the emphasis on additional facts. More facts are always better than less. So let's welcome other people who are emphasizing other facts. Arguments on China, let's be sure we've got 2, 3, 4 arguments going systematically in that case. So yeah, and then realize one final very important thing. We are studying ourselves as human beings, and we can't be unbiased about ourselves, about the world we live in. So be honest about all that. I get so upset when somebody makes this kind of argument.
Trapp says that this is the authoritative treatment.
It sounds like it sounds like I'm an ideologue, I guess, because I don't believe it. But no, it's not true. It's just not true. And we could do great books that take 10 years to do research, and the whole country could benefit from that without having to make that claim that somehow or other.
Oh, well, good we have you out there holding everybody accountable. Let's go to our lightning round. Henry, this is where we ask all our guests to give their favorite Reagan speech, book, or quote. We'll take all 3, 2, or just one. What do you got? Any Reagan quote comes to mind? And Reagan book comes to mind? What are you particularly enthusiastic about? You want to share?
Well, my view about my favorite speech doesn't change, and that's the Westminster speech in England in '82. Now, why? Because there he ties together views that he had as a teenager on the world of the spirit and on conflicts being a consequence of spiritual matters. I mean, here's this continuity all the way to 1982, and that's the way he's defining the nature of the world. The other thing is that, of course, he says this and he predicts the victory of the capitalist system when we are at the bottom of our it was the nadir of his presidency. Absolutely, you had to believe the guy was
all right. So we got Westminster. All right, give me a book or a quote. What do you got?
All right, I've got. What was I going to tell you? Oh yeah, well no, I've got a quote. It's relevant to what you're talking about. Reagan was so good at this. He said, "Let's have moderation in all things, including moderation." Think about that one for a minute. And finally, what was the third? The book.
The book.
Yep. Oh, I tell you what, I wish I got to tell people, if you're going to write about Ronald Reagan, you're going to have to read Martin and Annalise Anderson's book, Reagan's Secret War. That'll blow your mind, and then you can start reading other things. And of course, there are great books from the early period, like Peter Schweitzer's book and Paul Kengor's books. There are some great books that have come out now in the last decade or two. Hayward Alka, he was a colleague at Cal.
Steve Hayward, The Age of Reagan's great. Yeah,
Steve Hayward, and then of course Bill Imboden's work.
The answer that only a scholar can give: you ask for one book and you give one, but with an addition of 5 or 6. We'd expect nothing less from you, Dr. Henry Now. Please, thanks for joining the show.
Thank you very much, Roger. Thanks a lot. Enjoyed it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.